But we're going to follow up on many of the things we heard from April. And we're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves, and then we're going to have a conversation, and we're also going to have Q&A on this panel. So if you have questions you want to ask, please think about them. So I've been a journalist close to 50 years. It's hard to believe for me. And it's a calling and something that I have loved doing, and freedom of the press has really been central in my life. Joel was going to talk a little bit about this journalist and the role of the press in a democracy or in any society, and he had a bunch of slides which we're not going to show, but I'll just throw out a couple of numbers. Right now, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, there are over 260 journalists in prisons and jails around the world because of their work. In 2016, 50 journalists were killed while they were working, which was a drop from 2012, when there were 81 killed, mainly because of conflict. But journalists and journalism are, just in framing what we're talking about in terms of freedom of the press, it's one of the only professions beyond law enforcement or the military where you're actually targeted and killed or beat up or put in prison because of your work you do. So I think journalists are crucial to society. I differentiate, and we can talk about the media and journalism a little bit, but we're going to be talking about each of our careers and a diversity here. Wasi, at the end, runs an organization, and he'll be talking about around Islam and Muslims, really around freedom of religion and the freedom to protest. But we're all going to start off and tell you all a little bit about our careers so you understand who we are and where we're coming from. So my number one experience really started when I was 22, a long time ago, when I was an editorial assistant on the Pentagon Papers. And I was part of the team, if any of you know about the Pentagon Papers, that was actually assembled in a hotel room in New York at the Hilton on 6th Avenue when the Times got a hold of the secret history of the Vietnam War. So when I was 22, I was literally Xeroxing and sleeping in a room at the Hilton Hotel with thousands and thousands of pages of classified top secret documents. And before they asked me to work on this project, and I was only a few months out of college, the editor said to me, "You don't have to do this because all of us may be arrested." And I'm like, "What? And what are we doing?" And he said, "Well, I can't even tell you what we're doing, but if you want to do this, come to the Hilton Hotel tonight at room 1111, he called me. "And don't tell anyone where you're going, not even your mother, and bring enough clothes for about a month." Well, that night I was Xeroxing the Pentagon Papers and going, holy shit, because it would say top secret for your eyes only. But really, what the Pentagon Papers at a very early age taught me was the role of the free press in a democracy, standing up to power, that there were tremendous risks and dangers, but it was really central to democracy. And as some of you know, the Nixon administration went ballistic, tried to stop it. It was the first time in the history of the United States, and the only time so far, when the government ordered a newspaper or any organization, media organization, to cease and desist publication prior to publication. The Supreme Court ruled it was okay to go ahead. 2 weeks later, 2.5, and the Pentagon Papers came out. Nearly 38 years later, there was a journalist in Oakland named Chauncey Bailey, Oakland, California, where I was, who was assassinated. He was the editor of a small African-American newspaper because he was a journalist. I didn't know Chauncey Bailey, and this was in 2007, but I was asked to run an investigation and try and find out who killed him, because the police were doing nothing, and bring the killers to justice. So a group of journalists together basically said, we're going to find the killers and hold people accountable and show that an attack on one journalist is an attack on every journalist. So I'm very proud of the work the Chauncey Bailey Project did, and it became known as the Chauncey Bailey Project, because the killers were brought to justice, and it was a huge unfolding of corruption in the Oakland Police Department. So that's a little bit about me. The last 10 years I ran a place called the Center for Investigative Reporting, which is one of the solutions to the downsizing and the financial collapse of journalism in this country, especially newspapers. And I think as we talk about the political environment we're in today, we can't forget the financial problems that have been created or which have led to a crisis of news and information, especially in small and regional communities all throughout the United States. And this also needs to be solved. And again, the role of journalists in those communities was essential to informing the public and holding public officials accountable. So that's another issue we might touch on today. But before I go on, I want to introduce Mila. Mila, many of you may know Sanina, who's the executive director of PublicSource here in Pittsburgh. And her personal story about journalism goes back to living really under a totalitarian regime. So, Mila, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself, and then we'll keep moving.
I can't top the Pentagon Papers.
No way.
Good evening, or good afternoon, everyone. So I actually I was born in the Soviet Union, raised in the independent country of Kazakhstan. I started my journalism career actually in the adjacent country of Kyrgyzstan, and was writing articles about government accountability. Got in trouble for the coverage that I did, and I thought that journalism is a done deal for me, that I still wanted to change the world, and I thought that I'm going to go into policy. That's how I ended up in Pittsburgh, going to the being a student at GISP, at Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And at that point, I actually got first an internship at CNN International and ended up working in Atlanta. Got a chance to spend some time with Christian Amanpour's team. That was the time when the Arab Spring has started and when social media was viewed as one of the tools to actually get the information and talk to people on the ground. As much as now, looking back, we see all the faults and maybe dangers that social media brings. At that point, it was an opportunity where a lot of people didn't know how to use it safely, right? How do you protect sources? How do you fact check? How to make sure that these are the people who are truly who they are? And so I ended up going off to CNN International, going to PBS NewsHour, and there continued working on the Arab Spring. After that, I ended up in local journalism, worked for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for 5 years with Tony Norman and many other beloved former colleagues of mine. And then after that, 2 years ago, I joined PublicSource, which hopefully a lot of you know is a nonprofit media organization that sees itself as delivering public service journalism in the Pittsburgh region. And we like to think of our mission as twofold. We are about transparency, government accountability, and community. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, I know the framing from listening to April, we're in this very adversarial moment, which we can't ignore. I don't think any of us consider ourselves enemy of the people. But Tony Norman here needs no introduction. So Tony, why don't you, I don't know what you want to talk about. I know there's a lot.
All I can say is that, how do you follow two resumes like that? I mean, Robert worked on the Pentagon Papers. He was editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Mila is just an international daring do journalist who just inspired me from the very first day I ever met her. And me, I'm just a very disreputable newspaper columnist, and have been so since 1995, though I've been with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette since 1988. So, it'll be 30 years this November that I've been with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I started out as a clerk and was a clerk for a little under a year before I was basically kicked up to the level of my incompetence, which was as a feature writer and a pop music critic. And after covering a David Bowie 9 Inch Nails concert, and wearing a suit, ironically enough, and getting vomited on, I decided that I had, basically been a rock and roll reporter long enough, and it was time to enter the adult world. But since no real adult beats were available, I decided to become a columnist, which was the greatest decision of my life, and very fulfilling. You get to deal with all the great issues of journalism in miniature as a columnist, and you also have the benefit of using your own voice, this objective eye, whereas all of my colleagues basically are limited to just the facts, ma'am. And I guess I see the value in the subjective voice, and I am really relieved and happy that I was able to figure out a way to be a part of this great business, and to be myself, and to contribute something to many of the great debates of the day. I'm a big fan of great journalism. I love to read the journalism of the progressive era, and I love to read. When I go into a new city, I'll seek out old bookstores that have old journalism books. I was just in Philly a couple weeks ago, my hometown, and there's a bookstore in the University of Pennsylvania area that I'd never seen before. It's the best bookstore in the world, as far as I'm concerned, because it has a whole row of journalism books, and I just spent $100, buying these books that are out of print, because I just want to read and see how the great journalists, of many generations ago navigated various problems. Because in the back of my head, I think that there's still time to somehow become a great journalist, before I get out of this business. So that's a little bit of who I am.
So Wasi Mohamed is the executive director of the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh and Emgage. Wasi, can you not only introduce yourself, but talk a little bit about how your community interacts with the press and the relationship it has, and also some of the issues you face? Maybe, it's obviously you're not a journalist.
Yeah, I'm that guy, yeah. Not a journalist. And yeah, I'm gonna skip a lot of the bio stuff, because if you said that you can't follow these two, Tony Norman over here, so yeah, my name is Wasi Mohamed. I'm the executive director of the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, also the PA State Director of Emgage, a Muslim political advocacy and organizing organization. The press, that's interesting. It's about my 5th year with the center, 3 years as an ED. A lot of engagement with the press, considering the climate the last couple of years. The Muslim community has been in the news a lot. And it allowed me to kind of form some opinions, that I don't think I could have formed if it wasn't for the fact that our community is under so much pressure. And what do I think is the true threat to the First Amendment, right? That's what I really came across. And my understanding, it's actually fear. When people are scared, they make weird decisions. And when societies have a lot of fear, they can sometimes make decisions and support policies that are against their foundational values. And we've seen it a lot, being from a community that's targeted right now, this happening constantly, right? And then we're like, how could this happen? So I don't know if you guys, has everybody met a Muslim here, any chance? Okay, cool. I was gonna say, I'm the first one, so some of you maybe. I hope it's not too bad. I was always confused on how could, the Muslims I know in my life, very normal people, very nice people, regular. There's some people who are jerks, but hey, that's just people, right? And it was shocking to me that how can the entire nation have such a negative perception of Muslims? And that's when journalism and the media really came in, and I realized that only 45% of Americans have met a Muslim. And that's at least one time. Yeah. Wow. That doesn't count really. Wow. Right? How can you really understand a population? But everybody's got an opinion about Muslims, And then they, as an individual who's at Harvard Kennedy Business School, between 2015 and 2017, analyzed media mentions, right? And then saw that at 68% of the times when Muslims were mentioned, first of all, over 90% was negative when Muslims are mentioned in the media. and on television and anything like that. So, looking at who's speaking on behalf of Muslims when it's on NBC and CNN and the major news networks specifically, and between 2015 and 2017, 68% of the time, journalists spoke on behalf of Muslims. 21% of the time, Trump did.
Wow.
8% of the time was other, and 3% of the time was Muslims. So there's some amazing Muslims here today. Sister Celeste Smith, Jasiri X, and Khalif Ali. These are amazing people. If you hear from them, you don't hate us. They're great. It's not who you hear from. You hear our story told from somebody else. And when that consistently happens, you can build a different narrative. So when you need fear in a society to get some kind of agenda accomplished, you need an enemy. And we're ideal, A lot of us from different countries, a lot of us are people of color. It's very foreign. Despite being an Abrahamic religion, people have no clue, what we actually believe. However, they're terrified of us in some way or the other. And that was manufactured by a group of interests, and we won't get into that, but essentially, that is allowed because you can cherry pick, there's an entire group that's spitting out all these pseudoscience studies and everything that says that Muslims are this or that, and then you can handpick which journalists and editorials you want to read or which hands get raised and you talk about whenever at a press briefing. And then you get a very biased view of who Muslims are, and then you never meet one. So our entire identity, most of America's view of me is determined by journalism. And my community who's targeted whenever negative rhetoric spikes, which is actually right around election time. If you look at a history of the last several elections, it's not when an attack happens, it's not, whenever something serious happens, it's mainly right around election season. That's when spikes in Islamophobia and hate crimes happen. So when that rhetoric comes, violence against the community follows. And when that negative opinion spikes of Muslims, attacks are made, mosques are prevented from being built. You have things like congressional hearings about Muslims and can we trust them, new McCarthyism, all that kind of stuff. That is a result of journalism and the media portraying Muslims in either a positive or negative light. And unfortunately, it's been negative thus far because a lot of the real journalists, which I'm very happy to be sitting with some today, do not get that spotlight. And then a lot of the focus, if you look at particular networks being thrown under the bus right now by a leader.
Excuse me.
No worries. If leadership, if elected officials can go and discredit entire, outlets and say these are the ones here and these are the ones happen to always be the ones that are very negative on Muslims, and then you paint an entire base with that view. Suddenly you've created an enemy. You can push policies. Since the time of Rome and Carthage, once you lost an enemy, it's difficult to have that social cohesion, but once you have one, it's pretty solid. So we have to be that one, unfortunately, as this administration and other political groups have decided.
Amen.
Is it for me?
That was,
I guess we.
Did nobody hear any of that?
no, we heard it.
You couldn't raise
So
your hand.
I'm going to interrupt. I think you just made a really important point referencing history in April. And some of the points April touched on, we're not going to get into because I think she was very articulate in explaining sort of what's happening from the top down. But she asked one question, who are we and how did this happen? And I think understanding history and American history, the moment we're in is not new. The authoritarian strain has always been there, and divisiveness has worked as a political tool.
Right.
And I think it's all, again, like I said, it's important. The attacks on the press are right out of the authoritarian's key playbook. You undermine the credibility of the press, you undermine the credibility of the judiciary, the legislative, or they're co-opted, and other things, name calling, all these things we've seen before. But I think the other thing I hope we can talk a little bit about is the danger, and we touched on it with April, of the difficult and terrible divide we're in right now, not only around politics, but where and how we find our information. So I wanted to bring it back to how each of you are dealing with that issue of the divide in the communities you serve. And just listening to Wasi, I think it's really important. I think his voice, even hearing that today, and I'm not sure where our audience breaks down politically, but this is a way to humanize and bridge this divide. But I want to ask Mila, here we have all this activity in Washington, but what do you see at PublicSource, and how are you trying to bring different voices in? Can you ameliorate the problem and work in the community here?
Well, I think, to sort of, I guess, use Tip O'Neill's phrase, all politics is local, I would say all journalism is local. Aside from, immigration and war, you have most issues that affect us are local issues. Is the water that I'm drinking safe? What did my state officials promise Amazon to bring an HQ2 to here? Are we going to solve our housing crisis? When it's going to happen? All of these questions are the ones that really matter for your neighbors and for us. So I think connecting with people and in person and being boots on the ground, that's why local journalism is so important. And I think also, the power of the first narrative. This is something that Wasi was touching upon, that sometimes we are just sort of in the hit and run mentality. We're just getting quotes, right? Rather than getting the whole story. I think we have tried to train and work with people on understanding on how to tell their own stories. First-person narratives are extremely powerful. And to work with a person to have that voice and gain that agency through a powerful tool of writing and working with an editor through fact-checking and understanding how structure and composition works is very powerful and is very much needed today.
Are you doing anything to try and bring the community together, literally physically, when you have divisive points of view or issues, to be a convener? Because I think the role of the press in a community, especially local and regional communities, the power of convening is something that I don't think we've traditionally taken advantage of.
Absolutely. So actually the mission of PublicSource is twofold. It's to inform and to engage. And Engage is exactly about that. It's from workshops that I talked about at the Media Funders Conference yesterday, that we have partnered with the library on, to conversations that are sort of smaller scale about, let's talk about race. And the divide in our own community, and large lectures as well. So we do treat that function as important.
I think I think part of we know we're in a difficult moment as a country in the world, but having solutions and hope is important. That's why I wanted to ask that question. And we've seen, and April alluded to it, really the power of when the press really reacts to something in the last 2 weeks with the issues on the border, and the images, the sounds, the pictures really can. Accountability creates change, and exposure creates change, which is a central role. Tony, you've been in the middle of a bit of a issue here with contretemps. Thank you. And just before you were telling me, how do you connect to your community, and how do you, in your difficult spot you're in, I would think, as a columnist, how have you addressed? I know you're right. Tell us about your column for tomorrow, and talk about how you connect to the community here, and how you see your role as hopefully as a connector.
Well, my column tomorrow is about.
Use the mic.
What was that?
Use the microphone.
Oh. Can you hear me now? Oh, did you guys miss all that other stuff I said? Well, it's just as well. It's just boring. Tomorrow's column is about my friend Rob Rogers, who's an editorial cartoonist who was unceremoniously let go last week, and so I basically it's an appreciation for what he does, and it's also I want to be absolutely clear that because contrary to rumors, people are concerned that if you work for the Post-Gazette, you have to buy into a pro-Trump agenda. And so my column is a counter to that. It's an argument against that. And it's a plea for folks to stick with journalism, an institution in this city that needs your support. And I've made the argument, on social media and so forth. And Brian O'Neill, my colleague, actually took a run at it in his column today. My column tomorrow deals a little bit with that, but it also just deals with my appreciation for what Rob has represented in our community. And it also starts off lightly with the fact that before this all happened, Rob and I went to a bar in Regent Square, and just to commiserate about the election results at the time, and we were still in a state of shock. And at the time, I remember saying, it was just a crazy idle joke. I said to Rob, let's have a mutual defense pact. If you get canned, I quit, or I get fired too, and vice versa. If I get canned, and I was just joking. Just totally joking. And of course, when he got canned, I was completely nauseated and sick to my stomach because I thought, I'll have to look at my caller ID to find out if it's Rob from now on, and whether I'll have to. No, I didn't really feel that way. But the column is about that, and it's something that the folks feel very tender about there. The Post-Gazette management, of course, does not feel comfortable having all these folks talk about things out of school. But the fact is that this is something that affects our whole community. Mm-hmm. This is the whole idea that you can keep something like this in-house is absurd. And so I wrote a column about it, and the last time I checked, it was still scheduled to run. Now, one of these things is, sometimes a thing like that can be pulled at the last second. But if it is pulled, if you look for my spot tomorrow and it's not there, please just go to Facebook, because it will be there. It will be all over social media. There's no doubt about that. How do I see myself in this community? I see myself, I try to be an honest broker. I'm not always right about things, but I try to honestly say what it is I believe, and I try to, navigate the various waters and to call things, I'm going to use all these cliches, to call things as I see them. And I think there's some importance in that. When I was given a column in 1996 actually, I was the very first Black columnist at the Post-Gazette, not in the city's history. Mike Seat beat me to that at the Tribune Review. But I really felt that I had a perspective on things that had never been expressed before in the Post-Gazette. Today, I feel that's still a very valuable piece of real estate. I get to explore so much there, and I get so much feedback from the folks here in town and nationally. It's been a wonderful learning opportunity for me, and I hope for my readers. And I've grown as a writer writing this column, and I hope that I've grown as a journalist. So to answer your question in a more pithy way, Robert, I see myself basically as an ordinary guy who's been given this incredible opportunity to be in dialogue with city leaders, national leaders, about the things that matter the most to people, and it's been deeply, deeply fulfilling. So,
Wasi, can you hear me? In terms of this broad question of dealing with this issue of the divide, and can you give us some examples of how you're trying to do that, how your community is trying to do that, and have you had dialogues where you actually have moved people or maybe changed their minds?
Does this work?
Sorry?
Can you guys hear me? This mic on? Okay, cool. So bridging the divide, generally?
That's a great question. At a community center, you have a lot of opportunities. We do a lot of organizing, social justice work that brings people together. The first thing that comes to mind, the atmosphere right now is negative. There's a lot of Islamophobia, but I can also see that as an opportunity. April mentioned this, like in U.S. history, right? Did anybody ever take a U.S. history class? How come nobody knows what's going on? And I have a mentor who always told me that this is a United States of amnesia. And I always believe that, and it's very true. I think which I realized, I was also somebody who didn't really understand our history until I realized, the oppression of Muslims in the country currently. The denial of rights. The imam in Florida got arrested. He got approached by the FBI and said, either aspire goodbye. He's on asylum, and you either go home or inform on your community, right? Or the create and capture tactics of other kids, and teens in lower income communities who are given money to just make deliveries of something. They don't know what it is, and it turns out to be bomb parts after a period of time. And this is our government, taxpayer money going to it. And I was like, oh, this is crazy. Look at all these tactics that are used and everything. And then I read about the civil rights movement, I read about the institutions that existed to monitor the leaders of that movement and disrupt that. And I read about even previously there, and I did go back to Rome and Carthage, but then even so, Japanese internment and everything. So what we realized is that this kind of concept, the amendments, right, like the Constitution, and then it just made me realize that it really wasn't written for everybody, It was written for a group of people. And unfortunately, some people have forced themselves to be added to that, right? But it's never really was created. So to me, the opportunity that we have right now, the First Amendment for the 21st century, maybe that can finally be the First Amendment for all of us, and how we hope to kind of get there is that sharing our histories. We actually did this How to Be a Muslim Ally training, and it ended with this concept of a wheel of oppression where we just hey, this is a cycle. And if we notice it, maybe we can break it, hey, the Muslim community is vilified, policies are passed, freedoms are taken away, people profit and benefit, it happens, right? That happened to several different minority groups. The people who are punished for amendments being, ignored for the quote-unquote national security or whatever reason that you want to take away people's freedoms are really the minority communities who are most often hurt by this. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest victim right now of Islamophobia is the 99% of people who are not Muslim, because they're victims of having so much airtime sucked up into this Islamophobia realm, right? We're 1% of the American population, and we are not out to get you. So having us on TV all the time and having it such a focus of dialogue, really takes us away from infrastructure and healthcare and things that really matter. So not only do the minority communities are the primary victims of this, the victims are also the American public. 99% of people who are not profiting or benefiting off of this, right? If somebody does an anti-Sharia law legislation, that's already, can anybody tell me why that's dumb? I don't know if there's a mic out there. You already cannot have religious law as a law of the land, right? So then why would a politician introduce anti-Sharia legislation? You get column inches, you get donations, you get to be the hero of doing nothing, right? So then that is somebody profiting. That's somebody profiting off of distracting voters and vilifying a minority community, right? And that's an American tradition. And maybe if we can all come together and figure that out, we can understand that when the next community post-Muslims
this audience, I think, is fairly comfortable and friendly towards what you're saying. You're in Western Pennsylvania here. Yeah. Are you in any dialogues with communities that may not be as comfortable with who you are and hearing this message?
And that's the most fun stuff. Absolutely. I go a couple hours outside of Pittsburgh. It is not like Pittsburgh, and also I grew up in central Pennsylvania.
What do you mean by that, Wasi?
It's not as colorful. But the questions are really colorful. I always ask people, ask the most offensive question you can think of. And so what I've realized is that the thing that we focus on, right, with this concept of, we're hoping to build some kind of movement around an understanding of we're all being manipulated and tricked by these things. Yeah. Because it's not just, my community. I'm actually saying that the Muslim community may be at the bottom of this wheel. We may be the most hated right now. We may be whatever. And all these things that are happening to us. Our focus is
is that this doesn't happen again, that there isn't some other minority group thrown under the bus, and then we focus on them and the American public is distracted while people steal resources, right?
Yeah, and this is, again, historically, this is not a new phase.
It's not,
Islam
no.
right now, it's happened
Absolutely.
before. And one of the reasons I'm not talking about everything that President Trump does or says is because we're well aware of it. And I'm trying to push this towards, quote unquote, maybe solutions or opportunities. We're talking about the 21st century and how we can create dialogue, and even counter the attacks on truth or the facts. And we're seeing that happen now. But, we talk about a journalism or media problem, and there's a huge difference between, in my opinion, journalism and media. Media is a lot of entertainment right now, and that's blurred the lines between opinion and facts and information and reported information or investigative reporting. So I think that's important. And there's really an audience problem. It's not a journalism problem. A lot of stuff is out there, but it's where the audience chooses to go and what they want to believe. And I don't know how we exactly change that, but I'd like you all, Tony, you have any thoughts on that?
We've trained audiences, media consumers, to have very shallow expectations of journalism. People do not look to newspapers or media sources anymore for truth because they've been basically intellectually swindled by politicians who really aren't all that clever. In fact, they're downright dumb in most cases, but they're manipulative, and they've learned that we're not particularly, as a culture, attentive. We're not attentive to our history. You think about the fact that, whenever black folks talk about simple facts of history, it's very, very contentious. You have a protest during the national anthem, and it becomes all of a sudden an attack upon the flag or the armed forces, and it was never about any of that. And it's almost like a shameless denial of reality on the part of the president, of course, but also on the part of the media that does not call that kind of misappropriation of reality out at every opportunity. The fact is that we humor lies. We humor the president. What April does every day when she makes her faces, she says it's not a big deal. That is in a way a protest against obvious lies by the administration. But I think that all of the reporters should make faces or not show up, because these press conferences don't mean anything. They're bullshit. And I think that if we stop covering them as if they were serious things and maybe withdrew and just let the press secretary come out and do her thing, but there's no one out there to cover it. As a protest, I think just once it will send a signal like, hey, truth matters. Corey Lewandowski, said womp womp, in response to, an 8-year-old, young girl, who was she blind? I can't remember what it was.
Down syndrome.
Down syndrome. He said womp womp. That monstrous character should never ever be a paid analyst for any news entity again. Not CNN, not Fox, and so forth. We have to systematically clear out the liars. And at that point, maybe people will start taking news sources seriously again. I can't take cable news seriously because they purposely employ liars. And it's very disappointing.
That's the entertainment piece of it,
Yeah.
and that's another, if you haven't written that column, you should. And I think, one of the dilemmas today is we have business models, which again is not a new idea, based on targeting an audience based on its belief. And, one half of the press can do what you're suggesting, but this is really gets back to this audience problem. So we're going to go to questions from you, but before we do, I just want to ask Mila again, I've sort of asked you already, but the credibility of a news organization is really its most important asset. And how have you worked to build that in Pittsburgh with PublicSource? And what's the kind of pushback you get on certain issues?
Well, I think that nobody likes transparency. That is obvious. I think people in power don't like when the reporters or journalists or the community knows too much. And I think that it doesn't matter what party you're affiliated with. That's just the rule of the game. And the more you work, the longer I worked in the United States, the more I learned that it's more and it's harder and harder to get records. It's harder and harder to get responded to. Your phone calls do not get returned. You're expected to write questions in advance. You're expected to talk to PR person first and get it cleared. I mean, all of that are additional roadblocks for transparency, and it prevents meaningful dialogue. And I think that we are living today in the world of tweets and press releases, where journalists are sort of like serving us lapdogs and not watchdogs. And that our responsibility is exactly to be a watchdog. I'm going to repeat myself from yesterday, but we're in the state of Benjamin Franklin, who believed that public debate should be robust, should be well-intentioned, and transparent. So when a black or brown kid gets pulled over by a police car, who matters in this situation? It's not Donald Trump, it's not Paul Ryan, it's the conduct of the police department. And if you do not have trust in that police department, then it becomes a problem for the entire society. Then, it's not democracy. It's not just democracy who dies in darkness. We have been sort of suffering and hurting in our community for the past 2 days because of Antoine Rose Jr. And I think that this conversation needs to happen and needs to happen transparently. And accountability is really, really important, especially in this day and age, and locally here in Pittsburgh. I think that, when the city of Pittsburgh or the county reprimands PublicSource for filing too many right-to-know requests, this is a comment on the sad state of local journalism.
So, bravo. Questions? I don't know how we're doing that exactly. Is there somebody with a mic out there? Okay. But I just want to throw something out also. One of the, again, a solution, I mentioned that in the last 10, 11 years I ran a place called the Center for Investigative Reporting, which is out in San Francisco's Bay Area. But when I got there were 6 people, now there are over 70. There are solutions here, but it really also relies on all of you in supporting news organizations in your community that you think can make a difference. The business model for-profit journalism is broken and probably won't be repaired because of all the disruption. So there are ways that people can get involved and make a difference also by supporting news sources you trust. So that's my pitch. Yeah. So does anybody have a question out there? Yeah, I can't really hear this lady.
I hope this works.
Yeah, that does.
You can probably hear me
we can hear
some
you.
distance from
How you doing, Mr. Kavanaugh?
I was the Nation World editor at the Post-Gazette, so this is a question fairly close to my own heart, but I wanted to throw it out there because I don't really have an answer. When we have a circumstance such as that with Rob Rogers, the cartoonist who was fired at the PG, the knee-jerk response from many has been, as Tony mentioned, that we ought to suspend our subscriptions. And naturally, my heart goes to my former colleagues to say, that's not a good answer. Those people will be put out of work. And many of them are laboring with good conscience and trying to bring the truth. So then the next question becomes, what is an effective response to that? And you can write a letter to the editor. Will he read it is another question. Will the publisher take heed of it? Will it even get printed in the paper? As Tony notes, he's not certain his column will appear tomorrow. I think these concerns about the direction that a paper takes and what the subscribers can do when it takes a turn that you find to be not humanitarian or in violation of your own principles and ethics. Each of the journalists at the paper have to themselves confront whether they can ethically continue working there under such circumstances. I know Tony's saying it's not affecting the news side. I've been understanding that there have been inroads into the news side in terms of even what news services are permitted to be on the front page and what are prohibited.
I'll answer that because I'm neutral, your question. Neutral in the sense that I don't live here, I don't want to put Tony on the spot, but I was the editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer and got fired myself, but not for any of these reasons. But I think it's really important that the community, as the editor, and here's a suggestion. You can, like you said, cancel subscriptions, et cetera, and I guess there were threats to do that if they kept him employed. But I think what's really effective is that the community together, en masse, or get as many people as possible, invite the publisher and the editor to a public forum and really hear them out and let them know what you think. Because if you can get a couple of hundred people in an auditorium, and I don't think they can duck it, and have it covered, have them explain themselves in public and hold them accountable in a way that journalists should be held accountable. And I think they owe it to this community to face that. It is not pleasant to come out and have to face a group of people sometimes over an issue you don't agree on. And let's see how courageous they are. I'd call them out.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. And I think for the record, folks should understand that most journalists there are fed up. And if there is any overt political pressure to violate one's conscience or to go in a direction that is contrary to their interests, the interests of the community, people will quit. I mean, I certainly will quit. I will not let my column be used as propaganda for anything that I don't believe in. I believe in only using my own propaganda, not anyone else's. So
I was going to say, the other thing you can all do is support PublicSource. Are you going to run?
Absolutely.
Are you thinking of running his cartoons, or have you?
You're putting me on the spot, Rosie.
Okay, sorry. All right, well, you don't have to answer. Another question.
Hi, I'm curious because all through the 2016 campaign, I was frustrated because I'm thinking, okay, this guy is not really saying anything of substance. And after a while, I started feeling like the press was enabling him and continues to enable him. So how do you tread that fine line into, providing information, providing news, but the person that's accusing you of fake news is the person that's actually providing the fake news?
We all could probably answer that. I think if you get information across from different platforms or different news sources, and going back to the 2016 campaign, you knew what was going on. I said this before, but it's an audience problem. And, the perceptions in this room of what President Trump says and does are pretty clear, but there's millions of Americans who see it completely differently. And I don't know how we bridge that divide, but in terms of President Trump and his shenanigans and all the things, the stories are out there, but the problem is people just don't want to believe them. They're believing what they want to believe. So, again, convenings like this are important, but it would be great if there's also people of different political persuasions trying to have a dialogue. I don't think the information's not there. It's just people chose to ignore it. And it also candidly goes to the whole issue of race in America and religion. We just, it's there. It's the way the country is built. We're hearing about that today. So these are issues that the best journalism attacks, but then the audience chooses what they're going to really hold on to, read, listen to, or watch in terms of film or video or television. So we...
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up, like, for example, like, we do our best to try to figure out how to reach that other side, right? Like the one that isn't, like, not the choir, exactly, right? So we're 1% of the American population, and we're not allowed to speak for ourselves in the media, right? So like, what are you guys' suggestions for minority communities to, try to change narratives, for even specifically to us, maybe just in general too? Like, what would you do? Like go to Central PA and set up a chair? Like, what's the best go-to?
I mean, what you're doing today, as much as you can do it, I think that human contact is really, really important. And you're dealing, honestly, with lots of news organizations that have been cut back and don't have the resources to do it. I don't know the circumstances here. I keep mentioning Philadelphia, where I was the editor. When I was the editor in Max before me, the newsroom had about 630 people. I think the combined newsrooms there are a couple of hundred now, maybe a little more. But think of all the journalists who are not out covering the meetings or going to events like this. And that's a real problem. That's why part of the solution is in these nonprofits, and getting to news organizations that will tell your story.
But
And
I
that's
also
also
think that,
events.
I think that in-person interactions are very powerful. I mean, even for us, we are Pittsburgh-based, not a media organization. But when we go to Beaver County or Butler County or Greene County, and to cover stories there, it's tough because, people have distrust because they rely on Twitter feed of our president. And I think that where we have been successful is basically coming with an ice cream stand and having a bowl of questions where you pull out and the journalist answers questions and the person. You established a human connection. We're all driven, we are all driven in a way. We have trouble, I think, in America to connecting to our humanity. And I think that this is the element of storytelling. We all live with them. We live with them at Thanksgiving tables, at Christmas, with our family. I think finding those connections with people you might not necessarily agree with, or you might think you will never find connections with them, is possible. And another part of it, I do think that the media organizations also should be held accountable in a way that there is really no mechanisms to hold people accountable other than penalizing them by your behavior. So, if you are measuring your success by the amount of page views you're gonna drive, then you're gonna reproduce that success by publishing more articles that are gonna drive traffic. And in Pittsburgh, it's the Steelers. So if you want a lot of traffic, you're going to have the Steelers website. So what I'm saying is that we need to stop relying on that, over-relying on those measurements, because it's omnipresent. I mean, CNN does that, from CNN to local newsrooms. And it's not an effective measure of success, of storytelling or impact.
But it's the dominant paradigm. Is the metrics are what count.
Absolutely.
I've heard that over and over,
right.
and it's crazy. We have gotten away from storytelling. I'm convinced that if we were to revert to storytelling mode, in its purest sense, in its most optimistic sense, where you really actually engage the community and you go out and you find the narratives that mean the most to those communities, our newspapers would be flourishing. Right now they're very sectional. Right now, they are, okay, what happened on Grant Street? And there's no attempt to show how the beats sort of connect all the worlds. There's the sports section, there's the Metro section, there's the A&E section. And in many ways, we need editors and writers who are more holistic in their approach to the news. Because, all of life should be captured in our news stories. But right now, it's pretty much crime, punishment, sports. And maybe a little bit of, City Hall corruption.
And a lot of Donald Trump.
And a lot of Donald
Next
Trump.
question.
There was a question here.
One of the firing issues that I haven't heard this afternoon was the firing of City Paper editor Charlie Deitch over his reporting of Darryl Metcalf.
Right.
And I think that one of the ways, for me, one of the solutions to support the First Amendment is that we really need to promote more people running for office. We need to get some of these folks who've been so destructive to the journalism and to media out of office, and to get our viewpoint in through our candidates. And so we have the First Amendment, but I also think we need to support our, like for me, the 19th Amendment, my right to vote and my right to get more people into office.
Right. Well, Daryl Metcalf has very few opponents up there in Cranberry, and so that's the problem. Find candidates who can run against Daryl Metcalf, who can kick his ass. You know, you need, you know, that's a very Republican, very red district, and Democrats are just afraid to go up against him. He's very well funded.
Yes.
Hi. I'd like to just make a quick comment, kind of on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, to be radically optimistic about the First Amendment. And I would think of things like Reddit and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of these sites. The First Amendment is not only the press, it's also individuals. All of these companies were founded in the United States of America thanks to the First Amendment. I think there's a lot of great discourse happening about public issues on these platforms that isn't the press. Those guys are making a ton of money. I'm curious to hear comments on the broken business model and how does that get fixed?
Well, the broken business model, which I can speak to in terms of newspapers, was just a huge fixed cost. And again, I know from my own experience, in Philadelphia, the cost structure was about, I'll do this quickly, $500 million. And about 12% of that 12% was in news gathering. The rest of it was, you know, cost was trucks, fuel, gasoline, paper. So the business models for the web-based news sites are obviously much, much cheaper, and they have been successful. I'm not pessimistic about the First Amendment. It's just under assault right now, and you know, really from the top down. And the counter narrative is really being set up for when the real bad news comes for the president. And basically, it's going to be, you know, the course has been laid that you can't, these are lies, and you can't trust the information that's probably coming out in the future. But I think there are, you know, the internet has created tremendous disruption, obviously, and also opportunities. There are websites, any of you know Now This News, which is a Facebook-based video. They get about 80 million downloads a month, and it's aimed all at millennials, and they're a minute and a half news clips. So there's a tremendous amount of diversity, but I think what we're focusing on in this convening is really this assault on, you know, trusted information and disruption around that. And that you can't deny is happening, and it's something historically that has led to a lot of horrible situations. And the more awareness of that is part of why I'm here today, to keep, you know, talking about that.
I actually agree with you. It's an audience issue. You know, like Reddit, absolutely, like it's a tool. You know, I go on there. They still hate Muslims there too, right? But there's a lot of positive stuff. But it's like, you know, what do you choose to look for, and then how do you vet that? You know, like, to me now, an understanding of news and media is it just entertainment, right? As journalists expect to be entertainers, which that's not the role. You know, it's a bedrock and foundation of a strong democracy is a strong, you know, strong journalism, strong press. But if that is mixed into with entertainment and that's what we're expecting from it, then I don't know, maybe you should change education. I don't remember learning in school like that press were that important, you know, like, and that's so important. It's crucial. It's how our community is defined to hundreds of millions of people, to billions if you look across the country and see, so across the world and see what's happening. But I never understood that. So maybe like going backwards, all of these things, you're right. There's a lot of ways to get information now. But if we have some lens that we're giving people, you know, maybe through schooling, maybe through growing up, maybe through some other means that y'all can think of, for them to look at all this information and get something, it might be better.
Again, I think what you're saying is really important. And historically, the first institutions, whether it was somebody running, you know, 10 miles, the town crier, that was controlled was information. That's the key to controlling societies. And disruption around technology. Who, you know, 10 years ago, would anyone have believed that the most effective publisher and who reaches the largest and most influential audience in the world is doing it through Twitter? Today, it would have been unthinkable. So I think, again, these disruptions are ahead of us, and technology has always been abused by people in power to serve their purposes, depending, you know, for good and evil. I think we have time for one more question.
Hey, I'm Liddy Barlow from Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania, and I have really appreciated this conversation about the press and about freedom of speech. I'm wondering if we could maybe pivot in this last question to talk about the first two clauses of the First Amendment, which are, of course, about our freedom of religious expression and non-establishment of religion. In the last few years, most of our discussions around freedom of religion have focused on arguments that invoke the phrase religious liberty to do things like restrict access to contraceptives and help people not get the kind of wedding cakes that they wanted to order. I'm wondering if you could expand our understanding of what religious liberty truly looks like and mention some other threats that you see to religious liberty in the 21st century. Thanks.
All right, well, I'll start. I mean, very quickly, like, as a Muslim, and what I see, and the link to communism and McCarthyism, it's because, like, Muslims are suddenly now treated as, like, foreign agents, you know, in some way. So then liberties are being stripped because we're seen as this other, it's this dangerous thing, and if Islam spreads, then the hold of other countries spread here. So then we are then reminded consistently through policy that our religion is not the norm here, and it's not what this country was founded upon, right? So like the Muslim ban is obviously one thing that everybody can see. And to me, I think this is great looking back, right? Like, because we can really use this as teaching moments. So if you look at the Muslim ban, he said it. I want to ban all Muslims from America, you know, like from this country, and then he said it in several different ways. And then, you know, he said to everybody in his inner circle, like, hey, how do we make this legal? And somebody said that on the news. You know, this is ridiculous. I saw that, I was like, whoa, he said it out loud. You know, this has happened throughout American history, but never has it been tweeted and misspelled and just explained. You know, like, this is crazy. So we can look back and kind of paint that. So on the Muslim ban is an example. The different legislation and now how open it is. If you look at a lot of the national security team and if you look at other people within government, it's now seen as really positive, you know, like to insert God or Christ or something that says that I'm a person of faith, you know, and then that's how I'm acting right now. And if you try to take that away from government, you're against religion, right? And then as opposed to like as a Muslim, because I understand the value of having a secular government, right? I really don't want like Sharia law or like whatever people say, right? A secular government is so powerful because it can easily allow every single person to live comfortably within it and doing that. But when you have a majority of one religion, no matter which country you're in, you know, like you can get a lot of people riled up and excited if you kind of play to that base, right? So then I think it's really up to people, like your organization's phenomenal, right? Working with large groups of Christians to say that that's like a trap. You know, like saying something that's, you know, pandering to this community for people who are questionably of, you know, the faith, to like say that, oh, you invoke these names or verses in order to get a large base of people is another form of manipulation, right? So like in a large, in like the sweeping statement is just that understand that's another form of it, be able to pick it out, and then this entire, like the policies that are going to consistently come, I think are going to be steeped in religious language moving forward in the next couple of years. And then that's not going to change because it's effective. And the only way to kind of combat that is to campaign of ensuring that our foundational principles of freedom of expression, of religion, and freedom to have any religion and to separation of church and state is kind of implemented, right? Instead of people trying to walk that back, to remind people why that's important. You know, like, and it's a foundation of this country, and how dangerous it is if we go in that other direction. But as a minority religion, it's easy for me to say that. I don't know if, you know, we can say
Well,
that.
I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you for that question. We didn't really get into religion, but I do think, again, from my point of view, there's a lot of stress out here right now, or I don't mean here, but in what we're dealing with, but it really is contingent upon everybody to do what they think the best thing is in their lives and try and make a difference in whichever you care them, in something you care and are passionate about. And, you know, 3 of us are journalists, you're involved with your community, and clearly we're all still very passionately involved in trying to do the right thing, and that would be my advice for the day. And thank you.
Thank you.